Dust rolled off the street of Red Willow, and it clung to a woman like judgment. Clara Whitfield stood on the boardwalk outside Pruitt General Store, holding a thin gold ring in her palm. Her stomach was empty for 3 days, and her pride was the last thing still breathing. Inside that store, one hard word could buy her bread or bury her in the sand. When she pushed the ring across the counter, the shopkeeper didn't even reach for it. He said, "Gold don't fill bellies." And he said it like hunger was a crime. Then the doorbell chimed, and a rancher stepped in, tall as a fence post, quiet as a loaded rifle. His name was Ethan McCall, and he looked at Clara's shaking hands before he looked at her face. He told the shopkeeper to fill her basket on his account, and he told her to keep the ring. Right there, with dust in her throat, Clara realized kindness could be more dangerous than cruelty. If you want the rest of this tale, you'd better subscribe now, because the prairie doesn't forgive latecomers. And tell me quick, did you drink water today, or are you running on coffee and grit again? Clara had been a merchant's wife in Missouri until fever took Thomas and Banks took the rest. She'd buried him under cottonwood shade, and she'd walked west with a carpet bag in silence. In Red Willow, she'd promised herself she wouldn't beg, but her knees were starting to wobble. Hank Pruitt pushed the ring back, and his stubby finger left a smear of flour on gold. He said, "Ma'am, I told you already," and he kept his eyes on the scale like it mattered. Clara whispered, "Just a loaf," and her voice sounded smaller than the bell above the door. That's when Ethan McCall asked real calm if there was a problem in here. Hank's shoulders lifted because he knew the McCalls paid their accounts and kept their word. Ethan tipped his hat to Clara, and the gesture felt like shade in the middle of fire. He didn't call her poor, he didn't call her pretty, he called her ma'am and waited. Clara hated that her hands shook, so she closed them around the ring until her knuckles ached. Ethan saw that ache, and he saw something else, a kind of stubborn dignity that wouldn't fold. He told Hank to fill a basket, cornmeal, beans, salt, pork, and a pinch of sugar. Hank grumbled, but his hands moved because ranch money talks louder than a widow's hunger. Clara tried to refuse, but Ethan cut that off, saying work beats charity every time. "My father runs McCall Ranch," he said, 5 miles north where the creek stays sweet. "We need a cook," Ethan said, "and we need one who won't faint when men get loud. Room and board, fair wages, and a roof that means something if you want it." Clara heard herself say, "I can cook," and the words tasted like surrender and relief. Ethan didn't smile big. He just nodded once, like he'd been waiting on that answer. He pointed to Mrs. Kearney's boarding house, and he told her to eat before they rode. Clara sat with stew and cornbread, and she forced herself to chew slow like a lady. Mrs. Kearney watched her sharp as a hawk, then said, "This country's full of second chances." Clara turned the ring in her fingers, and she remembered Thomas grinning in a St. Louis shop. 2 hours later, Ethan returned with a wagon, and Clara climbed up like she was climbing out. The prairie spread wide, and it looked beautiful and empty the way hard truth usually looks. Ethan drove steady, reins loose in his hands like he trusted the team and the road. Clara asked why he'd help a stranger, and Ethan said, "Because we're all strangers until we're not." He didn't ask for her story, but he listened when she finally said fever took her husband. Ethan's jaw tightened, and he said, "I'm sorry," like the words were a tool he used carefully. Silence rode with them, only wheels creaking and hooves tapping time on hard ground. As the sun lowered, Ethan pointed ahead, and smoke rose from a chimney like a signal. McCall Ranch came into view, house, barn, bunkhouse, and a spread of cattle moving slow. Clara felt fear again, because a new place can be kinder than a grave, but still demand blood. Ethan helped her down, and he carried her carpet bag like it weighed nothing at all. Silas McCall stepped out, older and wind-carved, and he studied Clara with a hard fairness. Clara met his eyes, and she said, "I'm willing to work, sir. That's all that matters now." Silas touched his hat brim, and he said, "Supper's at 6. The men don't like waiting." The kitchen smelled of dust and scorched beans, and Clara saw burned pots, stacked like bad decisions. Ethan apologized, but Clara was already rolling her sleeves because she'd learned survival is motion. She asked where the coffee was, and Ethan showed her. Then he showed her the stove dampers. Clara counted mouths, 8 hands, plus father and son, and she set her mind like iron. When the men wandered in, hats in hand, Clara didn't shrink. She stood by the table. Ethan introduced her, and his voice made it plain. This house had rules again. The youngest boy stared at her, and Clara could see he missed a mother more than food. Clara served beans that night, and she served them with salt and patience and quiet authority. Silas ate, nodded once, and said, "Fine meal." And those two words felt like wages. Afterward, Ethan picked up a dish towel, and Clara tried to refuse, but he wouldn't budge. "My mother made everybody help," Ethan said, and for a second his eyes carried Old Winter. Clara didn't ask more because grief is private, but she noticed he kept his distance on purpose. When the dishes were done, Ethan pulled prairie flowers from his pocket and he held them out like peace. Clara took them throat tight, and Ethan said, "Keep your ring too. We don't trade away memories out here." "Not tonight. Not ever." Clara set the flowers in a jar, and she slept with Boots beside bed tonight. Before dawn, the stove was cold, but Clara's hands remembered heat from older kitchens always. She struck flint, and the first sparks looked like tiny prayers falling into ash. Coffee went on first because ranch men don't forgive silence in their cups at sunrise. She mixed biscuit dough, and she kept her breathing slow so fear couldn't set the rhythm. Outside, the bunkhouse stirred, and bootsteps on porch boards sounded like a clock that bites. Billy hovered near the door, and his eyes followed the oven like it held treasure for him. Clara didn't coddle him, but she let him smell the coffee, and he grinned. At 5 on the dot, she opened the kitchen door, and she called, "Breakfast is served." Men filed in quiet, and hats came off because Ethan's voice had laid down law. Silas sat at the head, and his gaze measured Clara like he measured cattle at auction. Ethan took his seat to the right, and he nodded once, like a foreman approving work. Clara set plates down fast, and she watched hands move like wolves finally finding meat. The first bite brought silence, and that silence said more than applause ever could. Billy sighed loud, and Samuel cuffed him, gentle, because manners matter even on the frontier. Silas split a biscuit, and he said, "This is proper." Then he went back eating. Clara poured more coffee, and she felt her shoulders drop a fraction from the praise. After breakfast, she didn't rest, because a clean kitchen is a boundary line for respect. She boiled water again, and steam rose like fog covering stains she planned to erase. Ethan returned from the barn, and hay clung to his shirt like proof of early labor. He asked what she needed, and she said soap rags and a man to haul water. Ethan didn't argue, and he carried buckets without comment because work is his language. Clara scrubbed pots, and black scorch marks fought back, but she kept scrubbing anyway. She opened cupboards, and she counted flour, salt, beans, onions, and a jar of molasses. The pantry shelves were dusty, but they were full, and that meant the ranch had hope. At noon, she packed biscuits and dried beef, and she rang the triangle by the door. Ethan took the basket, and he said, "The men will talk." Then he smiled slightly. Clara watched him ride out, and she noticed he kept looking back at the house. She understood that look because a home isn't walls, it's the people inside trying. That afternoon, 3 riders came, and their horses looked too fresh for honest drifting work. Ethan brought them in, and he said, "They're asking for jobs." Then he watched Clara. The tallest one smiled slow, and he called himself Rourke Van, like it should impress. Clara felt her skin tighten because his eyes measured the room, not the men in it. Jeb Collins touched his hat, and Finn Doyle stayed quiet like a shadow holding breath. Clara kept her voice flat, and she said, "Those who work eat supper is 6. Rourke's smile didn't warm, and he said, "Fair enough." Then he looked at Clara again. When they left the kitchen, Clara's hands shook, but she pressed them flat on wood. Ethan appeared close, and he asked if she's all right, his tone steady and low. Clara told him the truth, and she said, "Something's wrong with that man's smile." Ethan nodded once, and he said, "Trust that I'll set rules they can't bend." Supper came, and Clara served beans with seasoning, cornbread with crust pork with crisp edges. The new men ate polite, but Rourke kept scanning the room like he owned tomorrow. Silas watched him too, and his eyes went sharp. Then he spoke about chores. After the meal, Ethan took a towel, and Clara didn't protest, because routine builds safety. He said Ma made everyone help, and his voice softened. Then he swallowed grief back. Clara rinsed plates, and she said, "Your mother must have been strong." He said she was. He offered to show Rosie the milk cow, and Clara followed, because learning means staying. In the barn, the air was warm, and hay smelled sweet, and Rosie blinked calm. Ethan showed her hands placement, and Clara tried. Then Rosie stood steady without fuss. Ethan said Ma called it thinking time, and Clara felt peace settle in that dim stall. On the walk back, the stars were bright, and the wind carried grass, scent, and distance. Ethan stopped at the door, and he said he's glad she's here. Careful words. Clara answered. She's beginning to be glad too, and she meant it more than expected. Before sleep she touched her ring, and she didn't cry because tomorrow demanded strength again. Days tightened into rhythm and Clara's cheeks filled out her hands, steadied, her voice sharpened. One Tuesday a shout came and Billy burst in saying Ethan's thrown, he's hurt bad. Clara ran to the corral and she found Ethan pale, holding his shoulder like broken pride. Silas said the doctor's in town and Clara said she can set it if needed. Ethan looked at her and he said, do it because trust is louder than pain. Clara counted softly and she pulled on 2, then the joint slid home with a pop. Men stared at her and Samuel whispered mercy because a cook shouldn't know bones like that. Clara tied a sling and she said, keep it still. Then she ordered Ethan inside. That evening she brought him food and she scolded him gentle and he laughed once. Ethan said she sounds like Ma, and Clara said his Ma sounds wise. He agreed. In that small room their silence changed and Clara felt danger because comfort can turn holy. Downstairs Billy yelled about seconds and Clara stood fast because duty saves hearts from rushing. In the kitchen she breathed and she knew this ranch could heal her or ruin her. Clara looked at the jar of prairie flowers and she chose to keep cooking tomorrow. The next morning, Clara rose before the rooster and she found Ethan already awake, sitting quiet beside the stove alone. His sling lay across his chest and his eyes followed the fire, like he was guarding something fragile in silence. Clara poured coffee for him first and she didn't tease because pain makes even good men childish sometimes at dawn. Ethan watched her hands move and he said her name softly, as if trying it on for size today too. Clara answered with a nod and she kept stirring gravy because tenderness felt risky in a room full of echoes. After breakfast, the men rode out and the house settled, leaving Clara and Ethan with chores that required trust alone. He insisted on drying dishes one-handed and she let him because stubborn pride needs gentle victories to heal well. Clara told him to sit and he said he'd rather work than think about fences cut in dark all night. She heard that worry and she remembered Rourke's smile, so she placed the old rifle within reach of her chair. Ethan noticed the rifle and he didn't scold. He only said she was learning the real language here too fast. Clara replied that hunger taught her fast and grief taught her faster. Then she changed the subject to fresh bread. She baked loaves for the men, and the smell drifted outside, drawing Billy back like a loyal dog at noon. Billy asked if Ethan would be all right, and Clara said yes, but her voice carried a crack of fear. She sent Billy to chop kindling, and she followed him out, wanting sunlight to chase thoughts away from her mind. In the garden she found weeds taller than onions, and she pulled them hard as if uprooting bad luck today. Ethan appeared at the fence line, moving careful, and he offered to mend boards despite the sling on his arm. Clara told him no. Then she softened and asked him instead to show her where the creek bent behind cottonwoods. They walked together without touching, and the prairie wind wrapped them, carrying the scent of grass and rain far off. At the creek, Ethan crouched, and he pointed at hoof prints, explaining how strangers leave signs for men to read. Clara listened closely and she realized the ranch had its own bookkeeping written in mud and water for anyone patient. Ethan asked about her father and Clara said he'd been a doctor once before. Drink stole his hands and honor. Ethan didn't pity her. He only nodded and said, "This land takes, but it also returns if you keep going." Back at the barn he showed Rosie again, and Clara tried milking, laughing when the bucket rang loud on stone. Ethan said his mother loved that sound, and Clara saw his grief ease, just for one breath, in the hay. Clara carried warm milk to the kitchen, and she made pudding because sweetness can steady a house after hard news. That evening Rourke lingered by the doorway, and he asked for second helpings, too friendly for a stranger to trust. Clara said he could have more if he split tomorrow's kindling, and her smile stayed sharp as a new knife. Rourke laughed and his eyes slid to Ethan's sling as if counting how long weakness might last on this ranch. Ethan stepped between them and he said, "The kitchen is Clara's domain, and her word is law under this roof." Silas heard the tone and he backed it up, saying men who push women get pushed out into cold night. Later Ethan apologized for the tension and Clara said she'd rather know danger early than late when it has teeth. Ethan asked if she missed Missouri, and Clara said she missed the idea of certainty, not the streets or people. She looked at the ring in her drawer and she admitted she missed being someone's safe place without feeling small. Ethan said she was a safe place now for the whole ranch, and his voice shook slightly as he spoke. Clara turned away to wash a pan because gratitude can look like longing, and she feared that in her eyes, Ethan laid a small book on the table, and he said his mother taught him letters by lamplight each winter. Clara asked to read it, and Ethan said yes. Then he watched her, like she was a miracle in motion. They spoke about recipes and storms, and Ethan teased that her biscuits could tame any outlaw if he got one. Clara laughed, surprised by the sound, and the laugh made Ethan's face brighten like sunrise over fresh snow at home. That night, Clara placed new flowers by the window, and she wrote her name on scrap paper to practice steady. She wrote Clara Whitfield again and again, then she wrote Ethan McCall and paused at the curve of his name. Outside, coyotes sang, and inside the house held warmth because two stubborn souls were building order where chaos used to. In the morning, a rider passed near the creek, and Ethan watched him hard, then told Clara nothing at first. Clara sensed the secret, and she said she'd rather be warned. So Ethan finally admitted fences were cut again yesterday. Clara didn't panic. She only asked who benefits, and Ethan said, Vernon Clay always benefits from fear in this valley. That name landed heavy, and Clara remembered bankmen in Missouri smiling while they sharpened knives with clean white paper. Ethan promised he'd protect the ranch, and Clara said she'd protect the kitchen because both fed lives every single day. When supper ended, Ethan walked her to the door, and he asked if she felt safe here with them all. Clara said she felt safer than the road, but she also felt the ranch calling her to choose for real. Ethan took off his hat, and he said he'd never ask her to forget Thomas, only to live again fully. Clara breathed in, and she said she could live, but she needed time, and Ethan said, time is yours always. He didn't touch her yet. He stayed close, and that restraint felt like a promise with weight in every breath. Clara went inside, and she pressed her back to the door, hearing his boots fade into dark down the steps. She opened the drawer, touched the ring, and whispered, Thomas, I'm still here, then closed it with steady, quiet hands. In the bunkhouse, laughter rose, and Clara heard Ethan's rare laugh, and it warmed her chest like fresh coffee again. She knew danger had arrived, yet she also knew something good was growing, and both were true at the same. Before sleep, she planned tomorrow's meals, and she planned tomorrow's courage because the frontier demands both from a woman alone. The wind outside carried distant thunder, and Clara decided she would not run first, not anymore, when her home needed. She blew out the lamp, and darkness filled the room, but fear didn't own it now. It only visited briefly. Somewhere beyond the creek, a man watched fences, and somewhere in the house, Clara watched her own heart wake up. Wednesday came with thin clouds, and Clara felt the ranch watching the horizon like a dog waiting for trouble again. Ethan's shoulder was healing, but his eyes stayed sharp, and that sharpness told her peace was borrowed time. Rourke Van rode the fence line at dawn, and he rode too easy, like a man rehearsing ownership in silence. Clara saw him from the kitchen window, and she kept kneading dough because fear never earned anybody respect out here. When the men came for breakfast, Clara served steady, and she listened for the small lies that slipped between big laughs. Rourke praised the biscuits loud, and he praised Clara louder, like praise was a rope he could throw around her. Ethan shut that down with one glance, and Rourke's smile stayed, but it sharpened at the corners for days. After breakfast, Silas assigned chores, and Rourke volunteered for nothing because men hiding hands often hide intentions too. Samuel noticed, and he muttered something, and Clara caught only the word Clay before the coffee drowned it. Ethan walked Clara to the pantry, and he said, Vernon Clay likes hiring men who don't mind dirty work. Clara asked if Clay was a rancher, and Ethan said he was, but he ran cattle like a banker runs debt. Clara nodded because she understood bankers, and she understood how polite men can ruin lives without raising voices. That afternoon, Ethan took Clara to the creek, and he showed her where their water cut through cottonwoods quietly. He pointed at fresh boot prints by the bank, and he said, those weren't from any man who worked here. Clara crouched, and she saw a cigarette stump, because strangers always leave little insults behind when they feel safe. Ethan's jaw tightened, and he said, we'll post a watch because water is more precious than cattle in drought. Clara returned to the kitchen, and she wrote a list of supplies: salt, lamp, oil, and more nails. She also wrote another list, names of men she trusted, because trust was a kind of inventory too. That evening, Rourke drifted into the kitchen, and he asked if Clara missed being a lady back east. Clara kept her tone calm, and she said she missed being full and she preferred work to empty talk. Rourke laughed, and he stepped closer like he wanted Clara to back up without him touching her at all. Clara didn't move, and she kept a pot between them, because a boundary can be cast iron when needed. Rourke's eyes flicked to the rifle by the door, and his smile thinned because he'd noticed her learning. Ethan appeared behind him, quiet as weather, and he told Rourke the kitchen was not a place for drifting. Rourke raised both hands, and he said no offense meant, but his voice carried offense like dust carries grit. Ethan replied that offense travels both ways, and he invited Rourke to leave the way you invite a snake. Rourke left slow, and Clara watched his boots because a man who leaves slow is planning to return fast. Silas came in after, and he asked what happened, and Clara told him straight without dressing it sweet. Silas listened, and he said the ranch isn't a saloon, and he'd remind every hand what that meant. Later, the men gathered by lantern light, and Samuel spoke low about missing cattle and fences cut clean. Ethan said we don't accuse without proof, but his eyes kept drifting toward the bunkhouse door all night. Clara poured coffee, and she asked one question: who benefits, because that question had saved her from fools before. Silas answered, Vernon Clay benefits, because he's been wanting this creek, and he's been patient like rot. Clara felt a chill, and she remembered Missouri papers and how signatures can hurt worse than any fist. Ethan walked Clara back to her room, and he said, don't wander alone, not until we know more. Clara told him she wouldn't hide, but she would be careful, because careful is not the same as afraid. Ethan hesitated at her door, and he said, you belong here. And the words sounded like a vow. Clara's throat tightened, and she answered, I'm learning because belonging feels earned, not granted to a widow. The next morning, Billy found a cut fence again, and he came running, eyes wide, voice cracking with worry. Ethan saddled up fast, and he told Silas to send Samuel north, because north was where Clay's ranch sat. Clara watched the men ride, and she felt helpless. So she chose the only power she had: readiness. She baked extra bread, and she packed cold meat because a fed man thinks straighter than a hungry one. Near noon, a rider appeared, and it was Mrs. Kearney from town, bringing news and gossip in equal measure. She said the festival was Saturday, and she said Clay's men were spending money like they'd already bought something. Clara thanked her, and she smiled polite, but inside she heard the word bought, and she tasted iron. When Ethan returned at dusk, he looked tired, and he looked angrier than she'd ever seen him yet. He said the fence was cut from the inside, and he said that meant somebody on payroll was opening gates. Clara didn't gasp because she'd already known, but she asked if Ethan told Silas, and he said yes. Silas called supper early, and he sat all hands down, and the table felt like a courtroom under smoke. Silas spoke plain, and he said anyone taking Clay's money would leave, and they would leave breathing, if wise. Rourke stared at his plate, and he said nothing, because silence can be a shield when lies are thin. After supper, Rourke cornered Billy outside, and Clara saw it, and she stepped out with a broom-like authority. Rourke smiled at her again, and he said, you're brave, but bravery won't stop a storm coming soon. Clara answered, storms pass, but snakes stay. And her voice didn't shake because she was done shaking now. Rourke's eyes hardened, and he said, folks talk, and they talk about Ethan needing a woman to soften him. Clara replied, Ethan doesn't need soft, he needs honest. And she turned away before her cheeks could betray her. That night, Ethan knocked once, and he asked if she was frightened, and Clara said no, just sharpened. Ethan exhaled, and he said, Saturday's festival might calm folks, but trouble likes crowds, and Clay knows that. Clara looked at her ring in the drawer, and she decided if danger wanted a stage, she'd choose her lines. Saturday arrived clear, and the prairie looked washed clean, as if trouble had politely waited for music. Clara woke before the men, and she baked pies slowly because crowds forgive nothing but remember everything. She packed biscuits and preserves, and she kept glancing at the creek, hearing Ethan's warning again. Billy bounced in the doorway, and he said, town's buzzing like bees, found a barrel of sugar. Clara told him settle down, and she handed him a crust scrap, because boyish joy keeps men human. Silas came in quiet, and he said Margaret loved festivals, so we'll show up decent today. Clara felt her throat tighten, and she nodded once, because she'd missed decency like she'd missed bread. In her small room she held two plain dresses, and neither looked right for lantern light tonight. A knock came soft, and Silas stepped in carrying a wooden box like it held a prayer. He cleared his throat and he said this was Margaret's, and she'd want it worn again. Clara opened the box carefully, and blue cotton with tiny flowers lay folded clean and patient. She touched the fabric, and she felt welcomed, because a dead woman's kindness can still speak. Silas added gloves and ribbon, and he said, "Don't refuse, because refusing would dishonor her memory." Clara whispered, "Thank you," and Silas nodded, then left fast before his eyes could shine. Clara dressed slowly, and she pinned her hair firm, because tenderness should never look careless here. When she stepped outside, Ethan turned, and his breath caught hard like wind hit a closed door. "You look beautiful," he said, and his voice was rough because honesty can bruise a man. Clara answered, "Your mother had fine taste," and she watched Ethan swallow grief down with pride. He helped her into the buggy, and his hand stayed proper, though his eyes didn't. Rourke stood near the corral, and he watched them, smiling thin, as if counting future leverage. Ethan didn't look at Rourke, and that refusal felt like a warning spoken without words. They rolled toward Red Willow, and the road felt different, because community can heal or judge. Clara saw lanterns hung early, and she smelled fried dough, coffee, and sweat from working men. Children ran between horses, and fiddles tuned up like the town wanted to forget hunger. Whispers followed the buggy, and Clara heard Widow Cook and McCall sliding together like cards. Mrs. Kearney spotted Clara, and she hurried over, saying, "You clean up fine, dear girl." She leaned close, and she said, "Let them talk, because talking's cheaper than helping ever was." Clara smiled, and she thanked her, because allies matter, even sharp-tongued ones in town. Ethan carried their pies, and he nodded to men who suddenly remembered manners around him. Silas arrived with the hands, and even Samuel wore a clean shirt, though he hated it. Billy ran off, and he yelled about roping contests making old men laugh despite themselves today. Clara set pies on the table, and she saw church ladies eye her dress approvingly. One woman asked, "Whose dress?" and Clara said, "Margaret's," and the woman softened without meaning to. That softness mattered because belonging is built one reluctant nod at a time in public. Ethan stayed near Clara, and he spoke little because he knew eyes were hungry tonight. Rourke drifted by, and he tipped his hat, saying, "Looks like you found yourself a home." Clara kept her smile calm, and she said, "Homes are earned, not taken, and not traded." Rourke laughed quietly, and he moved on, but his eyes stayed on Ethan's shoulder again. The pie contest began, and Clara judged fair because fairness is a kind of armor too. She crowned the minister's wife, and she kept her voice warm so envy wouldn't grow teeth. Ethan joined roping, and he took second place, because skill doesn't always beat hunger to win. Silas clapped once, and the men cheered, and Clara felt the ranch standing taller in town. As sun dropped, lanterns lit, and fiddle music rose, making even widows remember their feet. Clara watched couples turn, and her chest ached because Thomas had once held her like that. Ethan stepped close, and he asked, "May I have this dance?" his hand open, respectful. Clara hesitated one beat, and she said yes, because fear shouldn't be the only habit. Ethan led her gently, and his palm at her waist stayed careful, steady, and patient. He whispered, "I'm not much of a dancer," and Clara said, "You're doing fine, keep breathing." They moved in slow circles, and the crowd blurred because some moments narrow the world. Ethan's eyes held hers, and Clara felt heat rise, though the night air cooled fast. He said, "Clara, I need to tell you something," and his voice carried old bruises. Clara asked, "What is it?" and she kept stepping because stopping would invite panic to speak. Ethan admitted he'd been engaged once, and his jaw tightened as if chewing iron memories. He said Catherine came west curious, and she left quick, when loneliness showed its sharp edges. Clara listened, and she didn't judge, because she'd left a life too, though unwillingly. Ethan said she called this place a grave, and he looked away, ashamed of needing love. Clara touched his cheek briefly, and she said, "I'm not Catherine, I know what work costs." Ethan covered her hand, and he said, "That's why you frighten me and why I'm grateful." The fiddle shifted louder, and Billy whooped nearby, breaking tension like a boy slapping water. Ethan chuckled once, and Clara laughed too, and that laugh sounded like spring after drought. They danced again, and Clara felt the town watching, but the watching didn't feel cruel now. Between songs, Ethan spoke of Margaret, and he said she believed civilization begins at supper daily. Clara said Margaret was right, and Ethan's eyes softened because praise of his mother mattered. Rourke appeared at the edge, and he watched. Then he turned away, speaking to strangers. Clara saw him hand a coin, and she wondered who took payment, and for what purpose. She shook it off, and she focused on Ethan's hand because safety sometimes is a choice. They shared lemonade, and Ethan asked if talk bothers you, and Clara said, "Let them talk." Ethan looked surprised, and he said, "You're braver than most men I know, even sober." Clara replied, "I'm tired of losing," and Ethan nodded because tired can become strong in time. Night deepened, and Hank Pruitt poured whiskey, and tempers rose because whiskey remembers grudges too. Rourke and two town hands argued near the dance floor, and voices sharpened like wet stones. Ethan moved in fast, and he asked, "What's the problem?" His tone, flat, controlled, final. Rourke said, "No problem," and he smiled, but his right hand hovered near his belt. Clara felt her stomach drop, and she remembered Boots leaving the kitchen, slow, planning to return. Ethan told Rourke, "Walk it off," and he said, "Now, because now is where peace survives." For one long heartbeat, nobody breathed, and Clara heard her own pulse louder than fiddles. Jeb Collins grabbed Rourke's arm, and he murmured, "Not worth it, because hired men fear sheriffs." Rourke spat dust, and he backed away, but his eyes promised he'd collect later. Ethan exhaled, and he turned to Clara, saying, "You all right? Stay close tonight." Clara nodded, and she said, "I'm fine," but she knew fine was a fragile lie. They packed the buggy, and Clara thanked Mrs. Kearney, who winked, saying, "Don't let him stall." Ethan drove home slow, and the dark prairie seemed wider, because joy makes danger noticeable. Clara asked if Catherine hurt you badly, and Ethan said it wasn't her leaving, it was shame. He said, "I felt foolish," and Clara said, "Love isn't foolish, quitting is," and Ethan swallowed. The ranch lights appeared, and Clara felt relief, but also dread because home can be targeted. At the porch, Ethan helped her down, and his hands lingered 1 second longer than proper. Clara whispered, "Thank you," and Ethan said, "Thank you back," because gratitude ran both directions now. Billy's laughter carried from the bunkhouse, and Clara smiled, because the boy proved life continued. In her room, Clara touched the old ring, and she didn't wear it. She only held. She placed it in the drawer, and she whispered, "Thomas, I'm trying, please don't hate me." Outside, a horse snorted, and Clara heard distant hoofbeats because someone rode when they shouldn't. She lay down fully dressed, and she knew the festival's sweetness had just bought a storm. 3 days after the festival, the ranch woke up to silence that felt staged. Clara stepped onto the porch, and she saw crows circling low over the east fence. She didn't like crows that early because they usually followed something already dead. Ethan came out behind her, and he stared toward the creek without saying a word. Clara asked what he saw, and he answered nothing, which scared her more. Billy came running from the pasture, yelling that the wire was down again. Silas followed slower, but his eyes were hard, like he'd expected this report. They rode out as a group, and Clara watched from the porch, clutching her apron tight. When they returned, Ethan's face was gray with anger, not fear, but controlled anger. He told Clara 20 head drifted, and someone cut the fence clean from inside. Clara didn't gasp, because she'd felt that truth in her bones for days. She asked if there were tracks, and Ethan said boot prints led toward the cottonwoods. Silas set his jaw, and he said that wasn't rustlers, that was a message. Clara poured coffee, and she watched Rourke Van enter late, acting sleepy. Rourke took a cup, and he smiled at Clara like they shared a secret joke. Clara kept her face calm, but her stomach tightened because she hated that smile. Ethan watched Rourke too, and his hand stayed close to his belt without touching it. Silas said, "We don't hang a man on suspicion, but we don't sleep on it either." Samuel nodded, and he said, "Vernon Clay's been buying trouble all over this valley." Clara asked who Vernon Clay was to them, and Samuel said, "He's a drought with boots." She understood that because drought doesn't shout, it just takes until nothing's left. Ethan said, "Clay wants our creek, and he wants our grass, and he wants time." Clara said, "Then we can't give him time. We have to force his hand." Ethan looked at her surprised because she spoke like a strategist, not a cook. Clara told him Missouri taught her one lesson. Quiet enemies move paper first, then fire. Ethan said Clay doesn't need paper. He uses hired men and fear instead. Clara answered, "Fear still needs a schedule, and schedules can be broken if noticed early." That afternoon, Clara walked to the creek with Ethan staying close to his shoulder. He showed her the bank and the water looked clear, but the air smelled wrong. Clara spotted a dead coyote near the edge, placed there like a curse. She covered her mouth and she said, "Someone wants us to think the land's sick." Ethan crouched and he found a torn strip of red cloth snagged on a branch. He said that cloth wasn't ours, and his voice went quiet in a dangerous way. Clara asked if Rourke wore red, and Ethan didn't answer, which was answer enough. They walked back slow, and Clara felt the ranch tightening like a rope drawn firm. At supper, the men spoke less, and forks scraped tin and eyes kept lifting. Rourke talked too much, telling stories that didn't have endings like he wanted attention. Jeb Collins stayed polite, and Finn Doyle stayed silent, watching everyone like a trapped fox. Clara served seconds, and she kept her head high, refusing to look hunted. After the meal, Rourke lingered near the sink, and he asked if Clara missed town life. Clara said she missed honest faces, and she turned away before her temper showed. Rourke chuckled, and he said, "Honest faces are rare, especially when land is worth stealing." Ethan stepped in, and he told Rourke to head out because the kitchen was closed. Rourke lifted his hands laughing, but his eyes flashed at Ethan's shoulder again. Clara noticed that look, and she felt rage rise, because weakness invites wolves. When Rourke left, Ethan stayed, and he washed dishes one-handed like defiance. Clara told him he didn't need to do that, and Ethan said he needed to. He said, "If men see me resting, they'll believe we're soft, and Clay will smell it." Clara said, "Then let them see us working, and let them see us calm." Ethan asked if she was scared, and Clara said, "I'm scared, but I'm not running." Ethan nodded once, and he said, "That's the difference between a guest and a partner." Clara's cheeks warmed, and she changed the subject, asking when the supply wagon goes. Ethan said Thursday, and Clara said good, because we're going to town together. Ethan frowned, and he said, "Town's crowded, and crowds hide knives." Clara answered, "Crowds also hide watchers, and watchers can bring help when smoke rises." Ethan studied her, then he said, "You think like Ma, and that both comforts me." Clara didn't reply because she didn't know how to hold comfort without dropping grief. The next morning, the ranch woke to another sign, a gate unlatched near dawn. Billy found it, and he looked ashamed, like he'd failed a test he didn't know. Silas told Billy it wasn't his fault, and he said fault belongs to the man paid. Samuel rode north to speak with neighbors because pride won't stop a coordinated raid. Clara packed food for the riders, and she wrote lists like she was preparing for siege. She listed lamp oil, bandages, nails, and extra coffee, because exhaustion kills judgment. She also listed names: Samuel, Billy, Hank, the cook, and every man she trusted. When Ethan saw the list, he asked why she wrote bandages, and Clara said, "Because I'm not naive." Ethan's jaw tightened, and he said, "I hate that you have to learn this fast." Clara answered, "I already learned it. I just didn't know it had horses and guns." That evening, Mrs. Kearney's nephew rode in, bringing word from town, and gossip travels fast. He said Vernon Clay's men were spending money buying whiskey, boasting about easy water rights. Silas listened, and he said boasting is a form of confession for stupid men. Ethan asked who heard it, and the nephew said half the saloon, and that's half the county. Clara smiled slightly because loud enemies make it easier to gather allies. Night fell, and the wind shifted, and the bunkhouse sounded restless instead of tired. Clara heard boots moving outside, too late, too slow, like someone waiting for darkness. She stepped to the window, and she saw Rourke slip toward the corral alone. Clara didn't shout, because shouting would warn him, and she wanted proof, not drama. She went to Ethan's door, knocked once, and whispered that Rourke was moving. Ethan came out without a word, gun belt already on, like he'd been expecting her knock. They followed at distance using shadows, and Clara hated how natural that felt now. Rourke paused near the tack room, then bent, and something metallic caught moonlight briefly. Ethan's hand lifted, signaling stop, and Clara froze, heart hammering loud in her ears. Rourke straightened, and he looked around, and for a second his eyes swept past them. Clara held her breath, and she realized the prairie night can feel like a courtroom. Rourke moved on, and Ethan whispered, "He's caching tools, maybe wire cutters, maybe worse." Clara whispered, "Then tomorrow we set a trap, not for blood but for truth." Ethan glanced at her, and he said, "Once truth shows its face, it can't be unshown." Clara answered, "Good, because I'm done living with maybes and whispers in my kitchen." They returned to the house and Ethan walked Clara to her door like a promise. He said, "Lock it, and if you hear 3 knocks, it's me. If not, don't open." Clara nodded and she said, "I won't freeze. I'll do what needs doing." Ethan's eyes softened and he said, "I don't want you brave alone. I want you alive." Clara swallowed and she said, "Then stop pushing me behind walls because I'm already in this." Ethan exhaled and he said, "You're right." And hearing him admit that felt powerful. Clara sat on her bed fully dressed and she listened to the ranch breathe in darkness. The creek murmured outside and she imagined Clay hearing that water like a cash box. She opened the drawer, touched the old ring, and she didn't cry this time. She whispered, "Thomas, I'm still carrying you, but I'm carrying myself too, starting now." Outside, a horse snorted and somewhere far off a rider moved where he shouldn't. Clara closed her eyes and she counted the days like bullets because the next one was coming. Ethan didn't sleep that night. He waited. Clara heard him moving once, then heard nothing, and she knew he'd chosen silence on purpose. Near midnight, 3 soft knocks came steady, spaced like a signal, and Clara opened her door. Ethan stood there in the dark hat, low gun belt on eyes, clear voice barely above breath. Rourke moved again, he whispered, and this time he wasn't alone. Clara's stomach tightened, but her hand stayed steady because fear had already paid rent here. She slipped on her boots, grabbed the lantern but kept it unlit, and followed Ethan down the hall. Outside the ranch lay quiet, but the quiet felt wrong, like a paused song before thunder. They moved along the shadow of the house toward the corral where horses shifted and snorted uneasy. Clara saw 2 shapes by the tack room, one tall, one shorter, both crouched, both working metal. Ethan signaled her to stay back, then he melted forward like a man made of night. Clara's heart hammered, and she hated the sound because it felt loud enough to betray them. A faint scrape came, then a low murmur, and Clara caught Rourke's voice, calm and certain. "Clay wants the creek," Rourke said, "and he wants it tomorrow before neighbors wake up hungry." The other man answered in a tight whisper, and Clara recognized Finn Doyle's silence, breaking at last. "They're ready at the east line," Finn said. "Torches too. You sure McCall will bite?" Rourke chuckled softly, and that chuckle made Clara's skin crawl. "He'll bite," Rourke said. "He's proud, and that woman in his kitchen makes him reckless." Clara's breath caught, and anger flared hot, because being used as bait is a special kind of insult. Ethan froze mid-step, then he eased back. Careful eyes, hard jaw, locked tight. He returned to Clara, and he whispered, "You heard that?" And she nodded, once swallowing heat. Ethan said, "Go inside," and Clara shook her head, because going inside was how you lose. She whispered, "You said once truth can't be unshown. Well, now we show it to Silas." Ethan held her gaze, and in that gaze Clara saw something shift, not permission, but respect. He nodded once, then guided her back to the house where Silas was already awake, waiting. Silas listened in silence, and when Rourke's name landed, his face didn't change, but his eyes did. Silas said, "We don't confront him yet. We let him believe he's invisible. Then we watch." Samuel returned near dawn with 2 neighbor riders because word travels faster than bullets in a valley. Clara stood in the kitchen pouring coffee, and she watched men gather like storm clouds with spurs. Ethan laid out a plan on the table with a piece of Chalk Creek, line barnhouse, bunkhouse. He said, "Clay will hit water and horses, because those are the bones of a ranch." Clara listened, and she asked one question. "Where do you want me? Because I won't be blind." Silas looked at her a long moment. Then he said, "Kitchen windows, see the east line best." Clara nodded, and she said, "Then I'll hold the house, and I'll keep coffee ready for men who shake." Ethan's eyes softened for one breath, then hardened again, because dawn does not wait for romance. The first shot came just as the sun cracked the horizon. A sharp crack like a whip to the soul. Glass shattered in the kitchen window, and Clara dropped low, heart-pounding hands already on the rifle. Outside riders streamed from the east, more than a dozen, maybe 20, spread wide to circle. Clara saw torches flicker and she smelled smoke before she saw a flame catch the porch corner. Ethan shouted positions and men answered with movement boots, thudding rifles, cocking curses, muttered like prayers. Clara fired once, not to kill, but to drive a rider off the porch line, and the rider veered. Her hands didn't shake now, because training is just fear repeated until it becomes skill. From the yard, she heard horses screaming because someone had opened stalls to spook them into chaos. Clara's mind snapped to the barn, and she knew Clay wanted their mounts more than their blood. Ethan was at the back door, rifle up, face pale with focus, and he yelled, "Stay down." Clara yelled back, "Cover the barn." And Ethan glanced at her like he hated agreeing. Then a figure appeared in the kitchen doorway close, sudden smelling of sweat and arrogance. Rourke Van stepped inside, gun loose, grin cold as if the ranch already belonged to him. "Well now," Rourke said, "seems a shame to waste all this fire on cattle and boards." Clara raised the rifle barrel steady on his chest, and she said, "Take one step, and you die." Rourke laughed, and he said, "You won't shoot. You're a cook, and cooks don't want blood." Clara answered, "Cooks know where the knives are," and she didn't blink because blinking gives power away. Rourke's eyes slid over the kitchen, the table, the jar of flowers, and he smiled meaner. "Clay's paying good," he said, "and you're the extra prize, the soft spot that makes Ethan do stupid." Clara's anger burned clean, and she said, "You don't know what makes a man stupid. You only know money." Rourke took a half-step, testing, and Clara tightened her grip, ready. Then Ethan's voice cut through the smoke behind Rourke, quiet, deadly, absolute. "Drop it, Rourke," Ethan said, and Clara felt relief hit like water on fire. Rourke turned slow, and he saw Ethan in the doorway, rifle aimed, eyes like winter. Rourke sneered, and he said, shoulder still tender, "McCall, you sure you want to gamble?" Ethan said, "I'm not gambling, I'm ending it," and his finger didn't twitch at all. For one breath, the world balanced on a knife edge, fire crackling, horses screaming, men shouting outside. Rourke's hand twitched toward his holster, and Clara fired first, because hesitation is how women die. Her shot struck Rourke's shoulder, spinning him, gun clattering to the floor. Ethan stepped in, boot on the gun, and he said, "You chose wrong employers." Rourke groaned, and he spat dust, and he said, "Clay will still take the creek. You can't stop thirst." Silas appeared behind Ethan, rifle in hand, face carved hard by dawn and decision. Silas said, "You'll live to testify, Rourke, if you can keep breathing and keep honest." Outside, a new roar rose, the barn doors bursting open as terrified horses surged out in a stampede. Clara ran to the window, and she saw the stampede slam into Clay's riders, scattering them in chaos. Men shouted, some fell, torches dropped, and one torch skidded toward dry grass near the porch. Clara grabbed a bucket, dumped water hard, then grabbed another, because a home burns fast when fear feeds it. Ethan stumbled, once clutching his side, but he kept moving because stubborn men refused to die on schedule. Clara caught his arm for a second, and she said, "Stay with me," and the words surprised her. Ethan looked at her, breath ragged, and he said, "Always." Then he turned back to the door. In the yard, silhouettes retreated because hired guns don't love a cause, they love living. A single rider lingered far off watching, then turned away because Clay wasn't here to die today. The gunfire thinned, then stopped, leaving only crackling wood and the rough breathing of survivors. Clara stood in the kitchen, smoke in her hair, hands blackened, rifle heavy, heart still racing. Silas ordered men to chase stragglers only to the fence line because traps come after victories too. Ethan sank onto a chair, jaw clenched, and Clara saw blood on his shirt. Not much, but enough. She tore cloth, pressed it firm, and she said, "Don't you dare," because she needed his promise kept. Ethan tried to smile, and he said, "Bossy." And Clara almost laughed, almost cried, then chose neither. Outside, neighbors rode in, drawn by smoke, and Samuel's voice carried relief like thunder moving away. Silas looked at Clara, and he said, "You held the house, and that was the hinge of today." Clara nodded, and she looked at the porch corner, charred but standing, and she felt something lock into place. This wasn't a job now, it was a home, and she had fought for it with her own hands. Morning crawled in slow, and the ranch smelled of wet ash, coffee grounds, and horses sweating through fear again today. Clara stood at the sink, washing soot from her hands, and she watched sunlight find the bullet holes outside quietly. Ethan sat at the table, bandage pressed to his side, pretending pain was nothing because men do that sometimes here. Silas moved through the doorway, checking each corner of the porch as if trouble might hide in daylight too. Samuel and the neighbors talked low by the gate, counting riders who fled and counting friends who stayed. Billy carried water buckets like a soldier, eyes wide and bright because he'd seen real courage last night. Clara poured coffee, and the pot sounded steady the way a heart sounds when it refuses to quit. Ethan watched her work, and his gaze held gratitude, the kind that doesn't need fancy words to live. Rourke Van lay tied in the shade, groaning through a gag, and nobody looked proud about it. Silas ordered a man to ride for the sheriff and another to ride for the doctor, both fast. Clara stepped onto the porch and she breathed deep, letting the wind scrape smoke from her lungs. The prairie looked innocent again, and that innocence felt like the biggest lie the land ever told. Ethan came beside her, moving careful, and he said, "You did right, holding the house like that." Clara answered, "I did what needed doing," and she refused to let praise turn her into a trembling girl. Silas glanced at them both, then looked away, as if giving space was the only tenderness he understood. By mid-morning, hooves sounded on the road, and the sheriff arrived with 2 deputies and tight faces. He asked who started it, and Silas said, "Vernon Clay sent it, and we can prove it now." The sheriff looked at Rourke, then looked at Ethan, and he said, "Testimony matters more than anger." Rourke tried to smile through blood on his lip, but the smile failed because the game was over. Clara felt a cold satisfaction, then felt shame for it, because justice should never feel like sweetness. The doctor arrived next, carrying a leather bag, speaking calm, because calm is medicine before any needle. He checked Ethan's side and he checked Clara's hands, and he said, "You both got lucky." Ethan muttered luck had nothing to do with it, and the doctor replied, "Stubbornness is a kind." Clara sat while the doctor wrapped her burns, and she kept her eyes on the floorboards. When the doctor finished, he said, "Rest," and Clara nearly laughed, because rest was a myth on ranches. Outside, men patched fences, and men gathered horses, and men kicked dirt over, spilled blood, all quiet. Neighbors shared supplies without being asked, because a valley survives by memory of who showed up. Silas clasped hands with them, nodding hard, and he promised he'd do the same for them. Clara went back to the kitchen because food was still the fastest way to turn chaos into order. She made stew, and she made biscuits, and she set a plate for every man who'd fought. Billy hovered near the stove, and he asked if things would be normal again, his voice cracking. Clara told him, "Normal is just peace. You defend," and the boy nodded like he understood too much. Ethan entered behind her, and he leaned on the door frame, watching steam rise like a blessing. Clara said, "Sit down," and Ethan said not yet, because he needed to see the ranch living. She looked at him then, and she saw exhaustion, and she saw relief, and she saw love. That word love still scared her, because it sounded like a promise the prairie might punish later. Ethan spoke first, voice low, saying, "I won't pretend last night didn't change everything for us." Clara kept stirring, and she said, "Last night proved something. It proved I belong in this house." Ethan nodded slowly, and he said, "You belong, and I'm sorry I ever tried to place you behind walls." Clara set the spoon down, and she faced him, because honesty deserves eye contact, not motion. She said, "I'm done hiding, Ethan. I won't be bait, and I won't be treated fragile." Ethan swallowed, then said, "You're right," and that apology landed heavier than any compliment could. Silas stepped in, clearing his throat, and he said, "Supper's in an hour, and keep talking after." When he left, the room felt smaller, because 2 hearts filled it with choices neither could dodge. Ethan moved closer, careful, and he said, "Clara, I need to ask you something plain." Clara answered, "Ask it, because plain questions are easier than guessing in the dark." Ethan took off his hat, and he held it against his chest like a man in church. He said, "You came here hungry, and you kept your ring, and you kept your pride, and you saved us." Clara tried to speak, but her throat tightened, because being seen fully is its own kind of danger. Ethan continued, saying, "I won't erase Thomas, and I won't rush your grief, but I want tomorrow." Clara felt tears threaten, and she forced them back, because tears blur the world when you need clarity. Ethan reached into his pocket, and he pulled out a simple band, plain gold, not flashy, just true. He said, "Marry me, Clara Whitfield, not because I need a cook, but because I need you beside me." Clara's hands trembled, and she hated that. Then she realized trembling can mean life, returning to numb bones. She opened the kitchen drawer, and she took out Thomas's ring, holding it like a small piece of history. Clara whispered, "I carried you different, Thomas," and she felt no betrayal, only gratitude and gentle sorrow. She placed the old ring inside the drawer, closing it softly like shutting a book you'll reread someday. Clara looked up at Ethan, and she said yes, because the prairie had already taken enough from her. Ethan's breath shook and he smiled like a man who just found water after miles of dust. He slid the new ring onto her finger, and his hand lingered warm, steady, respectful, and real. Outside, Billy whooped, then pretended he hadn't, and Samuel cursed him kindly, and the porch erupted in laughter. Clara laughed too, and the sound surprised her because joy after violence feels like sunlight after storms. Ethan pressed his forehead to hers and he said, "I'll court you proper even if I'm limping." Clara answered, "Do it, and do it slow, because slow is how trust becomes stronger than fear." Supper bell rang, and the men filed in seeing the ring grinning wide because hard lives need wins. Clara served stew with a steady hand and she felt the ranch watching her like family, not hired help. When night fell, Clara stepped outside holding Ethan's hand and she asked one question for every listener. If you were starving in Red Willow, would you trade your memories for bread or gamble on a stranger?